Hello everyone, today we complete, and this time for real, our episode about medieval Egyptian warfare between the 11th and 14th century. Last time we interrupted our examination of sort of more strictly, if not Egyptian, but properly sort of Arabo-Islamic aspect, and especially legacy within the Egyptian armies during this period, regardless of their of the dynasties in charge. First of all, let me say that, of course, this series began about the various regions. I remember, I think, a couple of years ago. We're coming to the end of that. It will take still probably yet another year, but the bulk of it has been done. And at the beginning, I tended to focus more on the essentials of that, looking at sort of only a part, only a choice, an elite of select, in fact, iconographic and archaeological evidence. But for some countries, so far we've seen, especially like the Byzantine Empire, central northern Italy, and in this case Egypt, like we're talking about massive systems that admittedly, like we also split France in, say, France and Burgundy, for example. We also looked at three videos on the Iberian Peninsula. Just the Christian part we have to make, one I have in store about the al-Andalus, etc. But that really give you this concrete dimension of also the size of these military cultures just by this amount of evidence that we can look at, and that, as we have observed, has never really been incoherent considering the overall picture. Meaning we have this all these scattered sources that, taken individually, you would say, well, yes, we have this datum, it may match or not match with some expectations, but when you actually start taking them all in consideration in a comparative fashion, and not just the one of a single regional area, but let's say that also, of course, the comparison of these ones with one another in turn, you realize that there is a striking picture that you can get at this point mostly from Europe, that we have almost finished, and the Mediterranean. We will extend up to, I think, India. Also, we will cover parts of like the entire Asia, telling the truth, in a very condensed fashion. Then there are other series about, I don't know, for example, the ones about Chinese warfare that take in consideration also the cultures, the militaries of the various enemies or allies or neighbors of China in many ways. So we will go in enormous depth throughout also other series about historical unit types, armies, organizations. This is just for the sake of not really a geopolitical perspective, which I do not believe in, as far as the merely geographical aspect being so central in it all, but definitely one that can, in fact, pave the way for the more comprehensive understanding of the world. That's why I'm also, I must say, disappointed to see that, say, when maybe I upload the first video about the Egyptian warfare, this kind of get a certain amount of views, then I upload the second, it gets very low views. Like, it's part of the same thing. Like, I understand that many people click just on the novelty because they get curious and say, oh, what will Schwerpunkt say? Well, if you pose yourself that question, it's because you haven't known my work well enough already, knowing how I operate and why. And the sort of drop in views at the end of the day also reflects, unfortunately, that sense of, why would the best thing be concentrated just in the first part and not? So I always made it clear through Schwerpunkt that my content is specifically, if you could think this is a marketing statement, but everything that I make is intertwined with the rest. It's not a piece of information that I upload because I hope that it's gonna get viral, and so that because you may get entertained in a way or another. I'm here to make disclosure, right? And of course, I don't care whether I get, say, 1,000 at this point views per video or 300, right? But I noticed the disparities, and the meaning behind that is disappointing, because I understand what logic there is behind that, and it shouldn't be like that. And I know that it's difficult also to pass this message through, and that, of course, you're not required to watch anything in particular, but again, the dynamic behind that is what betrays some other general approach that is objectively astray, right? Compared to what the point of Schwerpunkt, the philosophy of Schwerpunkt really is. And admittedly, the channel is growing, though, so I always thank you for this. I know that there's especially a select core of of faithful followers, and subscribers that, and members also as well, that contribute, and you're really the ones who pull the cart, right? The rest is of course very important, but it's more pulverized in terms of individual support. Schwerpunkt has an important way ahead, and I hope also to improve myself, because at the end of the day, if something does not work, I can't blame it on you, as at least I can't do it only if I blame it on myself as well. So, I'm stern but fair on that. But back to our Egyptian warfare stuff, some further considerations at the end to wrap up. Yes, it's true, in the first couple of parts, like we have already highlighted, as essentially this more civilized, bureaucratic, urbanized, even westernized Mediterranean basin that fundamentally is much more similar in that regard to the rest of the Mediterranean than to the Middle East, right? That especially considering the actual section, like the Near East is something and the Middle East is something else. Just as a disclaimer, because I often use that distinction, to me, Levant is Near East, basically, and it's something basically like Anatolia, Syria, Palestine. I wouldn't even include Egypt, because to me that's mostly North African, but essentially everything east is Middle Eastern, right? So the Jazeera is a bit in frontier area in this, but say Iraq, Persia, typically that's Middle East. Arabia as well. In any case, again, it's not even that crucial in that categorical fashion. Going on with the evidence on this more Arab-Islamic characters of Egyptian warfare, there is a treatise on astrology by al-Balkhi, preserved at the National Library of Paris. This is the Arab manuscript 2583. It comes from actually Egypt or Syria or Iraq. We do not know precisely. However, it dates to the 14th century. As we've seen, there were many shared sort of influxes across all these lands, in spite of their important difference. At this point, 14th century, you have Egypt and Syria under the Mamluks, and Iraq is instead under the sort of more Mongol Persified influence. In fact, of the Il-Khanids, that is quite atrociously in competition against the Mamluks. And there is something in between, of course, that these peoples share. If anything, that frontier areas we've seen witness the settlement of lots of also Mongol political exiles, refugees of sort. Even from the Golden Horde, remember that the Mamluks take a lot of themselves in that sense as military slaves from Eastern Europe, from the Caucasus, from Western Eurasia in general, right? Especially in the northern part of the frontier with the steppes. Now, this treatise is important, as in the manuscript form that is preserved here, there is this debate regarding the origin. We definitely see a more markedly Persian influence on the wall. There is especially some Western Iranian or even Iraqi say context. You can easily see also being influenced by the previous Seljuk art, reinforced a bit by Mongol bias there. That is typically that Persified Turkish art. But again, a lot in between was shared. It could be Mamluk as well, right? And especially like in Syria and in any area where there was also a compaction really of the of forces clashing against one another, turning into some sort of hybrid frontier military culture. We see in the figures, in the illuminations, a normal recurved composite bow using the thumb draw, helmets with apparently rigid neck guards, also what are probably male aventails or tippets across the shoulders. These are somehow more Mongol Persian stuff normally, especially also in this manuscript iconography. Sabers are of the broad-ended type favored by the Mamluks. This is important because they were a bit more, a bit more sizable than the more sort of Central Asian one that the Mongols would probably use. The Ottomans would resent of this influence. They had similar weapons to the Mamluks a bit. There is also the tapering form, which is also a bit more, even more sort of Westerner in that anti-armor capacity, which definitely they would have had in Persia as well, but that is more typical statistically than the Western part of this war, because tendentially, like also the Il-Khanid tends to have that closer similarity with Central Asian armies with a very few but very elite heavy cavalry and then lots of horse archers. The Mamluks, as we've seen, had a more evenly distributed armor, like in interest of the individual soldiers. We see fluted helmets, vambraces protecting the lower arm. We, especially in the last detail, can appreciate like the technology was probably again shared, nevertheless, by the Mamluks, regardless of the origin of this manuscript. There may be here there are also different interpretations regarding the actual composition of helmets. For example, some may have been in scale, but this depends just on the artistic license sometimes of the drawers. We see an animal-headed mace, a broad axe held by a seated dark-skinned African or Indian figure of sort. We will see how these weapons did exist in India as well, but never forget the Egyptian tabardariya. We will surely make a video about those for the historical military unit series. I've always, you see here from the pictures I also uploaded, always found it fascinating that from Egypt we get this important deal of elephant, apparently war elephant depictions, right? Which is something you do not often get in the same way for even other Middle Eastern powers. This may have to do with it a bit like in the Ptolemaic era, where there were, at least they are mostly African elephants, but still an idea of connection through the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, with that source of war elephants. We will, if anything, talk more about this in another video. The Timurids at least brought some elephants from India, because otherwise their sort of Afghan, Turkmen, Persian background would not use. But it would be interesting to study this a bit more, also as far as actual African elephants from say, in fact, savannas, let's say, brought to Mamluk, let's say, to medieval Egypt in general. We have a painted paper fragment preserved at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Fletcher Fund 1907 SB60. This is New York, of course. This is Mamluk. It dates to the first half of the 14th century. The picture is not particularly refined, but we can see essentially unarmored troops, right? One fighter has the small round buckler, and he was surely striking with a sword, but the fragment unfortunately does not cover it. It's been lost. There is a saber next to him. It is very similar to that one we have seen in the previous episodes on the depicted on the gate of Manjak al-Siladar. That has what also we just mentioned as far as the manuscript, a broad non-tapering blade right, of that heavy type that again was peculiar of 14th century Mamluks and reflected that sort of more individual heaviness of the average Mamluk rider compared to, say, again, a Turkish, Persian, Mongol tradition. We have a Furziya manuscript preserved at the Keir collection in London. This is a Mamluk book from the late 15th century. That was a copy, however, of the 14th century original that we discussed, in fact, in other manuscripts, also in the previous videos. And once again, we have this illumination iconography. We see there that impressive range of Mamluk cavalry training, which is this text is about. And one can legitimately wonder whether, like, this was, say, faithful to the original iconography. That, as you know, in many, like, I know, in the Makamat, etc., with the zodiac, etc., in that case, you find it many times and places in Islam, and the iconography of the original manuscript is kind of always the same. This is a problem we have for later copies of in Europe of manuscripts that went lost, let's say, during the world wars, but had been copied during, I don't know, the 19th century. We just have that copy, let's say. There is all a problem of interpretation. This is, I wouldn't say, to be such a huge deal, because at the end of the day, between the 14th and the 15th century, not too much would have changed. However, we see, compared to the other manuscripts that we have, only 4 specialized forms of either naft, so it would be the liquid fire, like the Byzantine fire, carrying javelins or rockets. We've seen that Egypt apparently had some days for these explosives, even more than the places where mostly the crude oil of Mesopotamia, like the same liquid fire, got its fundamental ingredients from, at least in this sticky inflammatory one element. We see what is also probably a primitive form of handgun. We've seen how the Mamluks were among the first, among the most advanced, and then the quicker to adopt firearms specialists in a way, together with powers like Venice, especially also as far as naval artillery was concerned. We see throughout all the later Middle Ages some devices that really suggest, like in this case, that such explosive or incendiary projectiles were thrown by still sort of traditional engines, like non-firearms ones, and this would have not been so strong. I mean, some sort of ballistas, for example, that would remain pretty late in time, like in Western warfare, in use. 3 of these siege engines have a triple pointed blades, and it's possible that these were used to fix themselves into some sort of wooden structure that the enemy would have built, which is sort of interesting because we don't find too much, but there would have been ways to sort of grapple even siege towers, for example, to some enemy battlements, and unfortunately we do not have too much information, but it was an actual thing. We see a hand cannon that is, again, very similar, because also the technology fundamentally could not differentiate too much at the time to what was used in Europe and in the rest of Mediterranean, and also with, in fact, other areas of Islamic power. This is sort of smaller guns at large, and the Mamluks, as you know, did maintain like an important amount of firepower till the end, except it never got so standardized and or organized like the Ottomans would have at the beginning of the 16th century when they took over the Mamluks. We have yet another Furziya copy it's preserved today at least I think still at the Asiatic Institute that is essentially the Oriental Institute of St. Petersburg. And this is Mamluk as well, and it dates to 1474. We know that with that level of precision, and it's interestingly, and we know this too, that a copy that respectively dates to the mid 14th and the mid and the beginning of the 14th century. So it's a copy of a copy, also from the iconographic point of view, right? And actually, this seems to have been still a good copy. Anyhow, we see basically the same things we were saying before: the javelins with these giant arrows, with rockets attached, packages of naft plus fuses, 14th century hand cannons, handguns, and so we see a bow, right, being shot from these devices. We see here also an arrow crossbow bolt shown below the hand cannon, right? Which, as it was the case, especially for that time, remember the first illustrations of those kind of pots, like in guns in the first half of the 14th century Europe, like that. Some of the early projectiles were actual arrows, right, not bolts. Now, let's pass to, let's say, that group of evidence stemming from, let's say, a more strictly either North African, or we can say even Berber, or Arab, sometimes probably even Bedouin influence received by Egypt throughout its history. Remember that, again, there is this, especially at the beginning of the period, important continuity. We're talking the Fatimid era, of course, with some, again, Arab-Islamic, but also strictly North African connections that, aside from the general idea we have of the Berbers good at horse riding, skirmishes, etc., were mostly infantry-based. Like, also shorter range base. It wasn't a great deal of archery compared to still javelins in use. And this actually does combine well with that sense of greater, well, this depends on how you put it. I was about to say Western legacy in some ways. This has mostly to do with sort of the back, say, the North African hinterland. But I mean, it's very different from the showers of horse archery arrows coming from the east, from the Turks. Also pointing out that these weren't so crucial after all. There are the Dailamis, as we've seen, coming from the south of the Caspian Sea that are still around. They're simple, medium infantry with no other skill than, being spearmen and javelin. Of course, they had cavalry, etc., but mostly were infantry, and they still dominated around. As far as Egypt, for example, is some of the finest mercenaries available. But it's important to look at this sort of persistent influence in North African influence, and probably Egyptian military culture altogether. And there is preserved at the Coptic Museum of Cairo a carved wooden panel from the Church of St. Barbara. So this is, in fact, a Coptic community, Fatimid Egypt, dating to the 11th century. These carvings show some fighting scenes. We see horsemen and foot soldiers quite meaningfully fighting against one another. And this is in part a mix of local tradition. In fact, it's shared by both the Christian and Islamic art of medieval Egypt. All right. And because of that bias that we said before, for some sort of more sedentary way of war, right? More infantry in general, also in Egypt, not just in North Africa per se, because this is a sort of much more, again, stable and stabilized system than others that were sort of a bit more feudally inclined in the Middle East. We see a rider using a straight sword, which is also interesting because it does refer to some greater likelihood of heavy targets to strike rather than cutting into. We do not really see Kion. The guy has a small round convex shield, which is interesting because it's small, and so it is somehow lighter than, I don't know what Europeans would have used, but it's also convex. It speaks of some sort of offensive capacity, as the guy that literally has to advance, also pushing with this thing and sort of being more exposed from the surroundings as he's getting to like some more single combat, which is maybe in part a reminiscence of tribalism of some mercenary, but it can also be a matter of sort of more increase in individual professionalism from the side of some soldiers. The infantryman has, by the way, a dagger with a slightly curved blade as well, which would have also been typical as a secondary weapon to be sort of curved. Think about, I don't know, the skirmish axe also in European tradition. It wasn't very far away in time. At this point, still the Viking era. In fact, this combination, primary, secondary, say sword and dagger, and this also smaller shield is very common to some parts of Islam, really, and especially for the infantryman, it's again very sort of North African to some degree, which is also probably very accurate compared to what was happening in combat, right? And consider here we see a cavalryman fighting against a footman as well. There are no key honor guard on the horseman's sword, right? Which may actually have to do with the sort of state of this carving per se. However, we do see in North African art and as well in Southern European illustration some likely, in fact, North African warriors wielding these guardless and keyon-less swords, which in that sense suggests for actually some more chopping capacity of sword, which is interestingly enough here used also by a cavalryman. So again, there's nothing categorical about the combination, but of course, like North Africa was not also particularly heavy in arms and armor. Egypt being, in this sense, also a bit more exceptional. In fact, being separated from the rest, that's why I also deal, of course, with Egypt separately from North Africa that we already covered. And it could be, again, altogether something that the Fatimid army would display because of a Berber influence of sword. In Constantinople, I will never say the other name of the city, because there is none other. At the Askeri Muzesi, we have a sword that numbers 2382, coming from 12th to 14th century Egypt. Right. It's difficult to date the sword because, like, normally, like, swords weren't even that overwhelmingly different. And however, part of the reason may be that this was an older type of sword that, however, was still in use in later times, like being manufactured in later times proper, after the previous Arab-Islamic styles that would have been sort of typical in the sense of either Egypt or North Africa. Remember, again, we will see it better. I actually made a video, if I'm not wrong, about the Fatimid army organization. There you can find how all those ethnic regiments worked. As you know, there were people coming from different regions, and so it's not strange at all to find all this sort of influences, especially from North Africa. There are fragments of painted paper dating to the 11th, 12th century Fatimid Egypt. I do not know exactly where this comes from, where it is today. However, it was documented at a point showing some interesting combat details. There are some Berber or Arab cavalrymen that were, in this sense, actually the numerical backbone of Fatimid cavalry forces, and especially in the earlier period. We do not see armor, interestingly enough, nor shields, or actually any other protection except spears. These have blades of the wasted form. One bears a pennon. And again, this would be so normal to an extent. I mean, we were saying that before for the Dailamis that I discussed. Also, in another one of these series for, I think it was the one about Jazeera, Iraq. That is armor, like the technical side of the story is not that important compared to moral forces. Like if you are a good fighter, and considering the general material poverty overall of these early eras compared to, of course, I don't know, even just the later Middle Ages, you realize that even essentially unarmored warriors can be quite aggressive and offensive and successful against, opponents that are most likely, on average, of the same kind, because that's always the thing, but that in fact do not fight against enemies that have more than just a narrow numerical elite of armored opponents. And naturally, wherever these guys came from, of course, they had armor themselves. But just the fact that they're not showed like this actually suggests a sort of normality, of course, for the numerical bulk of these fighters not to have been that armored. From Fustat, we have yet another paper fragment. Remember that Egypt, just for papyri of ancient times, due to the local, mostly dry climate, are extremely well preserved. Right, so we have such great evidence from this type of sources. This one dates to the 11th to the 13th century. Again, it's not easy to date. It's currently preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art, Inventory 14698, Cairo. In fact, also the art is not particularly thrilling. It's possible that this paper fragment dates actually as late as the Mamluk period, so starting from the mid-13th century onwards, but it can be otherwise. We do not see a great sophistication. There is no Kion, for example, which could be North African influence on the sword, as the one we pointed out before. There is a nasal used on a tall round helmet, which is also a relatively archaic feature that may have been connected, as a matter of fact, with some kind of it could be actually here a European, like a crusader, for example, represented, but it can be, especially the later it goes in time, some sort of more archaic, I don't know, African type of helmet that would have recycled at some point also some crusader one, or there were Frankish mercenaries, as we've seen also in North Africa, and so the fact that nasals are so rare in Islamic art throughout this period overall makes us suggest mostly that Western influence, but possibly through the same Africa connected with that Kion. And so you understand here all the various directions where these influences come from. It's not like this is the point of this series in many ways, that it's just a geographical proximity or a straight line, right? There are many channels through which these influences may have occurred, and often not easy to understand here the whole picture. At the monastery of St. Anthony in the desert, very famous for early Christianity, as you know, so made some videos about this, we have a wall painting. So here we're in Coptic Egypt, of course, dating in fact to the 13th century, representing St. Theodore Stratilatus. And this is interesting because it's sort of very local, and as you know, Coptic art does maintain a lot of archaic features, just as it is the case for the Byzantine tradition at large that it was inspired from. It was, of course, here the big elephant in the room. We've seen it, if anything, in the last part of this video. The last video we made about that. That, of course, there were strong contacts between the Byzantine Empire in Egypt for a very long time, right? There were Byzantine troops actually in Egypt at some point during the 12th century. There is a broader picture that, if anything, at some point we'll have to draw again, as the Byzantines were trying before the arrival of the Seljuks to reconquer Jerusalem, to of course trying to reunite the Levant in a sense. But what is fascinating about this art is that it does also feature some Abbasid artistic tradition of sort, and this is kind of obvious because it doesn't matter how antagonistic the Fatimid or any other Egyptian power to in that case the Fatimid, because they were Shias, but in general, like to the Abbasids that had been taken over by this point, as you know, by the Seljuks, and actually the 13th century is the same one in which the same Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols, which is not exactly something that should be celebrating, given the amount of treasures that we lost from there. In any case, in fact, would have irradiated, right, dramatically in terms of artistic, cultural, morals, even as far as Egypt. That is not also too distant, of course, and these were sort of well-connected areas. In any case, here we see, again, this is Coptic art still, regardless of some Islamic art influence, iconographic influence. You see the warrior saint holding a spear, but also a large saddlecloth on his horse as well. We do not see much, well, like the entire, for example, the entire animal, that the interior part is lost. But the reason why this element is so relevant is that this cloth may have actually been an entire caparison, which is something that we do see also in, say, part in Mamluk tradition, a bit similar to what you see in Europe as well, because again, the Mamluks were with the rank emblems, with lots of aspects like very similar to Western knights, right? And so rarely, let's say, we see any form of horse clothing or armor in general, because mostly belong to the elite. Maybe the comparison, not much of the elite, but still to some type of fighters that definitely were not common as the others by status, etc. And so there is also, this could easily intertwine with how much we think, of course, that the weather, let's say, in the Levant would have influenced the type of gear towards some more padded. Also, considering the lots of horse-archery that we know existing, of course, there at that point, especially after the arrival of the Mongols, now, like, could have influenced this entire sort of protection. How, in any case, we do not get much, like whether this was padded clothing, for example, or something else. Again, then we have at the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston preserved the automata. So yet another manuscript dating to 1354, coming from either Egypt or Syria. So in both cases, it's a Mamluk context. And we see here something that you don't see all the time. Like, it's some sort of device mechanically used to train knights, right? Essentially a movable statue, like the one of the jousts, or this kind of other games that existed pretty much everywhere since antiquity, for all cavalry, and this proves of agility and etc. to stiffen reflexes and so on. And we see this having the shape of a veritable horseman, right? It's a statue. It's a movable statue with a spearhead in his hands. It also is massively large, almost in an exaggerated way. Here, the reason why we list it among the North African sort of, or Berber or Arab influences, is that it has a bamboo shaft, right? That is also apparently, again, proportionate, unlike the spearhead we just described. And as you know, bamboo shafts are typically Arab, right? Arab lance shafts are mostly made of bamboo, and it's obviously possible that there were some Arab auxiliaries using this in the Mamluk army, but it's also plausible that some Mamluk knights would have used similar shafts as well. The idea is that these shafts were some poorer version of the bulkier corner ones used by the Mamluk knights, right? So there would have been obviously some sign of ethnic status distinction, but again, it's possible that some Mamluks, of course, would have been of Arab origin as well. Like they didn't have necessarily to be Turks or Europeans or wherever they got them from, right? Could be also that Arabs did fight in the same way there. Made also a video about Arabia here that for the same series that talks about a bit the connections with Egypt. Not too many, telling the truth. Nevertheless, of course, this was, especially of course in the southwestern part of Arabia, sort of the more influent power as you understand, in say, foreign contributions. Then let's pass to something that is sort of more Turkish in influence, because we talked mostly now about the Byzantine influence, the Arab-Islamic one, the Berber, but of course there is a massive Turkish influence since the earlier Ghulams in Egypt. We have yet another fragment of a painted manuscript dating to the 10th, 11th century. We are in Fatimid Egypt. This fragment is preserved at the Kir collection. It's number 18. This is in London, of course. And so these fragments, as you understood, are also often damaged, but some of them are very neatly, very good in rendition. And there are many, pretty much elsewhere in Egypt. This is, I mean, Fustat is the most famous find, right? And it's the case for this fragment as well. So what's the point of Fustat in particular? This was a quarter of Cairo, to put the city that we know as Cairo today, that is really not inhabited anymore. And it was actually, at the time, the most inhabited, the most residential part of the same city. Cairo, as you know, stems from al-Kaira, that is to say, this is connected with Mars. It was all an interesting connection with this, but a royal enclosure palace city had been built just north of this Fustat quarter in Cairo by the Fatimids as they took over, right, Egypt. And so there is a lot there, of course, dating from the time, if you actually dig into that. Like, I don't even want to think about the sorrow state of Egyptian, historical legacy, because there is so much, but basically the locals don't give a damn. Let's be honest, about that. They're not civilized enough. Some of them just consider, for example, just the Islamic part of history, the rest to trash entirely, including the pyramids, the Sphinx, and so on. But let's not talk about this. Anyway, this is history too. This tells you where these people come from to begin with. Now, so there is a lot of conjecture considering the times and places, so the sorrow state of these fragments as well, regarding what kind of context also these drawings come from. I mean, these are obviously manuscripts of some sort. I mean, manuscript meaning books, right? Rather, everything that is handwritten is a manuscript. But saying which context, what they were actually representing, warriors, general, military context, it's not explicitated because of this this unfortunate destruction over time. But this fragment is perhaps the best we have. It's the most detailed, and it probably dates itself. We're not even fully sure that it dates to the Fatimid era. This fragment could, however, represent, this is just an hypothesis, but it could be the case, and celebrate, by the way, the famous Turkish gulam, essentially mercenary soldier of fortune, because that's how they could make fortune that way. So gulam, so it's another term more or less equivalent to Mamluk as a slave soldier, but gaining great precision, power. This was the case also for, as you know, slave soldiers in Islam, regardless of Mamluks, that still technically still existed as this generic term aside from the later proper dynasty of the Egyptian Sultanate. We're talking about this Alp-Takin, right, that would be depicted in this fragment in the moment which was welcomed into the Fatimid army by the Caliph al-Aziz. This was really interesting and important, given that the same Fatimid forces in the mid-10th century had been crushed by the more heavily armored Turkish Gulam, led by the same Alp-Takin. Very relevant aspect, because it's not like, I don't know, guys threw heavy cavalry into the melee, the Egyptians didn't know what that was, and so they won. No, that's not how it really happened, but tendentially, like the idea is that, of course, gradually the Turkic way to war gains greater importance in countries like Egypt that had previously relied again on this more infantry-based forces comparatively to the Central Asian one, right? And there's essentially here an extermination landscape depicted with two mounted figures joining hands. So it's just like after the bloodbath. In fact, there are literal limbs scattered, shield, etc. So this is after the head chop each other to pieces. We see one man, like one of these two guys, with mail, right, at his neck. However, we don't have the fullest picture of this armor, but it's likely that again it was covered by some fabric. It was an integral torso chainmail, but because it is covered by lamellar cuirass, which is also a very interesting indication of that more steppish kind of influence, typical of the migration era, already from the migration eras, and that's here would be connected exactly to this Turkic element. And so this is also interesting because it's the same period. This is very heavy armor because you have mail and lamellar over it. This is just a very ultra heavy force. The top heaviest, like the Byzantine Nicephorian cataphract, a 3-layer, like upper chainmail, lamellar, and other underneath chainmail. Plus, of course, padded armor could be underneath and over this also. That was the most ultra absolute heaviest cavalry ever. And it's likely that also, in fact, some Turks or other, some Arabs, but proportionally, like more from this type of influence, and or like Byzantine subtle compaction, like this ultra elite core that had technically not to find any other rival on the battlefield. You would associate to. There was some cloth tunic over this armor as well. This clearly covers part of his right arm, and the other seems to cover like the full length of his left arm, which is sort of strange. It's possible that this local artist, it was again probably very Arab, like very Egyptian, wouldn't be very familiar with this lamellar armor, right? And so here we're not even sure technically we're talking about Turks or anyone, so this could have simply been some Fatimid armor that surely existed in that fashion also way before this time, or any Turkic gulam, even though the Turkic gulams are as early almost as properly Islamic warfare itself. In any case, there's definitely some Eastern style involved, right? We see, for example, if we look at the rider's leg, we see him wearing a gaiter or boot below the knee. And this is very similar to pre-Seljuk Persian art. So, again, this is not even necessarily a Turkic thing. because again, most of the Turks we see in the West are heavily Persified, especially Seljuks, and so in any case, most of them did pass through an Iranian test of sort, also because they had blended with them prior. So it's a long story, but made lots of videos about Eurasian steppes of warfare. Now we have yet another drawing on a fragment of paper from Fustat, dating to the 11th to the 12th century. We don't, again, have any connection specifically to the Fatimid dynasty, but it's not of the Fatimid period, but it's not so crucial. This is, again, Kir collection number 132. And we see here, if anything, horse archer, right? Also indicating likely an Eastern influence, because as we said before, and also in the other videos, like there wasn't much horse archery in the Fatimid armies, especially the earlier ones. Again, that's mostly something connected with the steppes. It would have been naturally horse archers since antiquity around. This is not strange. Horsemen always used that, but at least in this prominent depiction by statistical, just think about how can you randomly find these fragments. Well, it's not in fact to be given for granted. It's likely connected with this early, say, Turkic Gulam presence. At the Bargello Museum, just the other day, I was making a video about the second half of 13th century Florence when the Bargello was built. So we're in Florence, of course. We have preserved a carved ivory plaque coming from Fatimid Egypt. We're always so again between the 11th and the 12th century. This is really interesting because it shows a blunt-ended dagger with a slight curve as well. This weapon is held in the seat, hanging almost horizontally, with your straps from the belt. This, as you know, we've seen it in other videos as well, is connected with still a general Islamic way of hanging a weapon, but that is also reminiscent of steppe influence in general from antiquity, and that in the way it's represented here, it's particularly connected to pre-Islamic Turkestan, right? Admittedly, also we don't get too much representation of this in early Islamic art altogether, so it's really likely that we're witnessing to yet another Turco-Iranian influence in Egypt of sort. And again, there is nothing strange about that. Again, this may have come even not just from Turks, maybe even from the aforementioned Dailamis. Another painted paper fragment from 11th to 12th century Egypt, preserved at Museum of Islamic Art number 13703. Some of these fragments go under the name of Fustat. In fact, this one is contentious in particular because of the iconography showing two warriors on the side of a bird-filled plant or tree, and standing like on foot, and so there's been it's a very particular type of iconography, and there are parallels with other parts of say other depictions in Islamic art. Some say that it would have come from Mesopotamia. Others think that it comes from instead like broader Fatimid reality. It's a bit difficult to simply distinguish the two in some frontier areas. There is surely some broad traditional meaning aside from any specific identification of who these soldiers are. Surely, again, they belong to some kind of, at the time, known and properly depicted. Again, this is just a fragment, as we were saying before. We do not know exactly what kind of manuscript this comes from, and it may they may actually be representing again actually an ethnic dichotomy. From one side, you have a Gulam cavalryman, so probably Turkish, Turkic in origin. Another may be instead a guy coming from Egypt, or North Africa, or can be an Arab in general. And of course, the Fatimid Caliphate would be like a fitting context for this presence, both the Turks and the Berbers, representing such a very important part of the local armed forces. So the guy would be a Turk, has some feather tie crown or some pointed helmet. We don't understand it well. It has brim, plumes. This may be a ceremonial headgear of some sort rather than an actual armor, but it's possible it's both. At the same time, we see again that sort of wasted blade type on his spear, which is especially close to other Fatimid evidence and 13th century Mesopotamian stuff that we have described in that video. We see a double-breasted tunic. This is very Turkic in style. Large boots, which cavalry-wise are somehow pretty fitting. The image seems to represent soft leather in composition. His sword leather belt has lost 5 decorative pendants, and remember that steppe peoples were quite exhibitionistic about their wealth. They tended to literally move with it, so some of them, also considering the general level of life expectancy for a warrior in the steppe, like just they carried it with themselves. It could be just a matter of status and saving their lives, maybe for a ransom, or showing again that was the actual manifestation of power that other warriors would have followed, right? We see this type of belts in Central Asia way before the Islamic tradition, or way before they're actually started to be depicted artistically anywhere, right? Naturally through archaeology. So this tells you how likely this was a Turkic gulam, as a matter of fact. The guy has a straight sword, but with a acutely curved hilt. And this is interesting as well, because we're talking relatively early times. And so actually the saber that would have dominated, especially from, yes, mostly in the Turkic world, but only gradually so, and also maintaining, in fact, in part, that level of Iranian straight sword tendency, was still a mainstay in many parts of the steppes that thus were not yet like it could be even just a symbol of status. Remember that again, some sort of sabers already existed and were more adequate for lighter troops, right? Ones that had to fight against mostly softer targets because they didn't have armor to come that close to the elite, right? So there is all some connection here. So especially the hilt curve in nature may have something to do with the way this, of course, the physics of the sword would have worked in a sort of single-edged proto-saber fashion. The aforementioned strap belt, say straps hanging from the belt in the Turco-Iranian shape for holding the seat is, is pretty clear as well. This coming from the Eastern tradition. The other warrior, as you understand, is less sophisticated because he belongs to a sort of, at least by status, some sort of tendentially more primitive background, poorer background, let's say. He has a spear, a turban, tunic, and he probably has a mail shirt under this that has a sash, loose trousers, simple shoes. And so even though it's actually a well-equipped soldier, he expresses, as we were observing before, the elite of a much less armored people at large, like the ones in North Africa or in Arabia, at least from especially the nomadic background, right? At the British Museum in the Department of Oriental Antiquities, we have a painted paper charm depicting Jazraphil riding an elephant. It's very crudely drawn, but we can see a curved sword, right? right? So it's regularly tapering saber. The depiction here is dated to the early 13th century, or around that period, which would make the saber one of the earliest ever depicted in Egypt. To say how long it took before that kind of more, again, Ayyubid and Mamluk, more Oriental bias to have a grip like on the local styles and the pictures. Naturally, art and what was actually used in battle at the time are two very different things. Nevertheless, I mean, not too different, but still something you can't, in this case, just use as a parallel per se. Nevertheless, it does fit the general pattern, right? We see sometimes also some artistic licenses. It's possible that the Ayyubids were first, like the major force, especially under Saladin, to introduce this more, again, Kurdish, Turkic type of equipment. We have other Coptic art, this time from a gospel preserved at the National Library of Paris. This is the Copt manuscript number 13. It dates to 1179-80, right? Hell, years at the time. This is before Hattin, and it comes from Egypt. So there are lots of figures, fortunately for us, to appreciate. Of course, we're talking again about substantially Byzantine art. Regardless of the fact that we're looking at Egypt, so there are evidently some Fatimid, early Ayyubid, Byzantine styles combined all together. However, in particular, there seems to be some Syrian bias, iconographically wise. Remember again how also particularly unstable still the entire Ayyubid power in terms of the connection between Syria and Egypt, especially before Hattin really was. Like there are the Crusader states in between, and from one side you have the desert, and from the other you have the Mediterranean. So it was always complicated strategically and logistically coordinate everything. But as you know, eventually the Muslims succeeded in there. So we see obviously lots of Byzantine features, but also Islamic ones represented. Again, I observed all these in other videos dedicated to surrounding regions. You can appreciate yourself in our playlists. One of the most interesting aspects, perspectively, also as far as this more, say, Mediterranean dimension, so to say, or Levantine, let's say in this case, especially opposed to the Middle Eastern Turkic one, is that this gospel art, illumination, presents a lot of pre-Turkic, in this sense also pre-Mongol kind of influence all around, right? This is a topic we have already addressed at many, by tiny bits, and it's something I perhaps will make a more comprehensive video on. But the sense is that essentially, regardless also of the styles that we just illustrated, pouring like into Egypt, it's from quite a long time, from the eastern border, even as far as Central Asia, the gospel is purposely representing some more local, especially Turkic elements that are perceived as sort of the more weak, like infidel one, regardless of the fact, in fact, it was an Islamic Egyptian power that still was seen as this. But not just there were Copts in Egypt, and it would be partly also under Seljuk rule in other places, but there is this sense of otherness attributed to more Middle Eastern powers, and so there's a choice that highlights in this case, because it represents some Christians, and so also more like the Byzantine influence in the material, like in arms and armor, prevalently, or other local styles that do not really come from another Islamic oppressor. This sort of time machine into the elements that are not spoiled by that tradition. That would in fact disappear gradually under the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, that, as we've seen, bring a bit more of that Turco-Mongolic element, even though they were mostly fighting against whichever power was from that side. And so even something like infantry, it's something that really persists. Of course, the Mamluks had infantry, like no army was without infantry, but that was a much more prominent arm in the previous armies of Egypt, of its dependencies, than it would be in the later era, right? It's much more feudal, chivalric oriented. And it's just also horse-archery, right? In fact, we see in this Gospel's illuminations lots of infantrymen. We see swords, javelins used by them, a non-tapering blade of a type that is seen even in very old times, even before the Islamic conquest, and even as far as India, right? This is fascinating. We'll make a video about medieval Indian warfare introductively, and then get a bit more into the depths of it soon. So there is nothing here that points at the Central Asian influence of the Turks or the Mongols. Well, the Mongols had this yet to come here, but still, of course, there were contacts. We see the spears being mostly javelins, telling the truth, which were also carried in pairs. Remember what we said before also about North Africa in general. There are kite-shaped shields with a flattened base, similar to, again, what you would call the Yanuviya. This would have probably been, in fact, an infantry shield, because it would have been at least resting on the ground, still held by the guys. I mean, also the Roman scutum could be rested on the ground. This mostly depends also on that anti-horse archery capacity that we do witness in the Arab world. We made a video about the Haddad militia, exactly, of Syria the same year, so there is much to say about this. This type of shield, by the way, is very similar to the one carved on the Bab al-Nasr that we documented these gates, like in sort of heraldic devices, right, on these gates. Not different from what we did, I don't know, even in Europe, with actual shields hanging over, the gates or something like that. Scabbards are slung from a baldric, which is also rather archaic fashion. We see a couple of maces, but they're not overly clear, so probably not so excessively important overall. But there is definitely a type of polearm with a sort of mace or axe on the head. We also don't understand well how this is made. We see only one archer, and even though this is one of the best figures from the entire Gospel, we see the bow held over the arm, which is very similar to other Mediterranean iconography, especially in some areas of the Byzantine world. And that has, in fact, nothing to do with the Middle East, with the Persians, the Turks. So yet again, some sort of, well, in this case, we said it, like there is some Byzantine influence, but this is very technical in nature. So if we assume that this is an Egyptian or Syrian, especially Syrian-influenced manuscript, still an important choice, an important influence, probably does reflect some local reminiscence of this before, especially the Mongol tide overwhelmed a bit everything and everyone. Especially a certain quiver may represent an attempt to depict Turkic horse archers. The still that is late 12th century date are rare in Egypt, and that may have been injected, as we were saying before, by Salah ad-Din. It's also possible, in fact, that this Coptic artist copied some of this iconography of the illumination, the Gospel's illuminations, from another model, right? That we do not know, we can sort of understand, but it's possible that he was unfamiliar with some of the equipment that may actually show like some of the few, in fact, Eastern elements that are still, again, likely, especially with this more elaborated quiver connected to horse archery, and so something more Turkic in style, brought by the Ayyubids. At the Staatliche Museen of Berlin, we have an inlaid brass bowl, late Ayyubid or early Mamluk. We are in the 13th century. We don't know whether it's from Egypt or Syria. Consider I made a video about Syria and the general surroundings, so we sort of focused a bit more on the characteristics of a properly Syrian, say some distinctive characteristics of Syrian warfare in these centuries. Otherwise, we have to presume that there was also an important similarity between Egypt and Syria, especially after, at this point, like in the 13th to 14th century, after Jerusalem was conquered, and basically the Ayyubids and the Mamluks managed to extend the control gradually up to the end of the 13th century on the entire Levant, right? Essentially expelling the last Crusader outposts. Now, this inlaid brass bowl represents, again, we don't know where it really comes from, but we see a horseman really resembling some mid and late 13th century Syrian and Armenian Christian manuscript illumination iconography. This is interesting because you could think there of some Coptic connection of sort with also Armenia, that, as you know, wasn't just Caucasian Armenia, but the Cilician one that bordered Syria. This guy has a lamellar cuirass. He uses his legs with the traditional Middle Eastern two-handed grip, which is interesting because also the Caucasus, also the Christian Caucasus, was heavily influenced since antiquity by this tradition coming from the ancient. In part, it was, you can't connect it even to the ancient Macedonians, but it's something mostly like throughout history re-injecting that region by Persia. And so a bit of a heavy cavalry cataphractor. In this case, we see lamellar cuirass, so we're looking at a heavy guy. There is another horseman that does not have the same armor, but we don't understand well what it is, but it seems to be wearing a Spangenhelm, which is something very archaic, of course, dating to at least, like, I don't know, the Viking era conventionally, but that in this broader East, this is true because, the Spangenhelm was originally from some models that developed from mostly an Iranian area, like that, say, from a Roman perspective, was especially like a Eastern European. Well, at that time it wasn't even a sort of Eastern Europe as we intended, but more or less the same regions and the Middle East, right? And so Sarmatians, Parthians used that alike. And such simple, such specific type of helmet is by now basically, like, in Europe disappearing. Like, it's connected at most in some very rarely, like, archaic places in Scandinavia, but not even mostly in Eastern Europe, also by general construction. In the Middle East, that kind of lives on, right? So it's not even so strange actually to see it from there. And the latter horseman weapon seems to be a single-edged, as slightly curved and broad-bladed saber, which is interesting because you see this coupling of heavier cavalry still in a. This is maybe very influenced by the Mongols already. So you see lamellar saber, but still with, I don't know, Spangenhelm and, some general sense of probably some heavier horsemanship. At least, of course, the Mongols had very heavy cavalry, but in general, like the hero, the hero is there the same. But I mean, this was quite a long tradition already in the Levant, especially, again, in Armenian Coptic tradition, also the Byzantines had something like that. In any case, when you look at this picture, especially the last on the bow of the last horseman, you realize that this saber is used in a sort of defensive manner, which is sort of similar to what later cavalry training manuals, even of the same Mamluk types that we've seen, that they focus very much on that, and we have beautiful illustrations, would suggest a pretty sophisticated kind of fencing. All right, and a quite unique one, at least in Europe, we didn't have that with sabers in general, and especially in this sort of bold fashion in defending with that, which is something that requires really, and that shows here that we're not talking particularly light troops, even though the saber was there. Remember, in general, the saber is for lighter troops, but we're talking about the small sabers for horse archers that just chase the enemy, nothing else. But they were massive sabers that were almost straight, and designed to cut through, ideally at least cutting through armor. That was at least like the main, like if you manage to cut through armor, it's because they destroyed the support in the same process. But never underestimate what kind of forces were being mastered, especially during cavalry combat, which seems to here, of course, very appropriate for even such more elaborate heavy cavalry combat, more elaborated fencing. Now we have another inlaid brass, this time box, made for the royal pantry of al-Adil. So this is either Egypt or Syria, something like the last years of the 30s of the 13th century. It's preserved at Victorian Albert Museum. It's a number 85081863. Beautiful museum in London. There are similar items to this produced in Iraq and Syria. We see an image on it that, in fact, is part of the same style of a guy holding a narrow, tapering sword. All right, this is interesting. A small round buckler were pronounced boss. This the fact that the keyon are non-symmetrical may suggest that this was actually a single-edged blade. Nevertheless, it's interesting, especially the tapering form, which again may be connected with this pre-Turco-Mongol substratum. Remember, here the Mongols are at the gate, so it's complicated. But again, those Turkic influences would have already been felt in that sort of more chopping level of blade development. Because I'm making these general approximations, but you know what we're talking about. It's not like you just fit either of the contexts if you have a single-edged blade or a saber or something. It's a long-term development we mostly understand also on a broader military basis that I describe, especially in the Eurasian Steppe Warfare series. I don't have time to digress now. The video is already long as it is, but it's mostly like an indicator by statistical recurrence of specific influences occurring at this time. At the same museum in London, we have from the inventory 740 1898 an inlaid bronze basin dating to the mid-late 13th century, either Egypt or Syria. And this is very similar to the Baptistère de Saint-Louis, which is much more refined and famous. I made a video about the Mamluk dress based on the Baptista de Saint-Louis. And that, as you know, has this multiplicity of fighters that by this date are either very late Ayyubid or already Mamluk. In any case, there wasn't that radical difference between the two and their equipment. There are various figures indeed. One has bare feet and putty-like leggings, so we think he's an infantryman, right? One is there's an ethnic divide. This guy is a Bedouin, an Arab of the aforementioned types, like the guys who used bamboo shafts, right? There may be part of the sword hilt or part of the saddle from protuberance rising over the camel's shoulder, and that may again be of interest. We see a horseman, a horse archer without armor, with a broad blunt-ended arrow, which may be connected with the fact that he is a hunter rather than a warrior. Another figure has a turban and a small lamellar cuirass. We've seen something similar before with that Berber next to the Turk in the tree. However, we see him equipped with saber now, which is something that would especially characterize 14th century Mamluk art and warfare in general. So you see here interesting blends of different elements of this great Egyptian cauldron. Again, historic, the various ethnic elements, but were also otherwise pretty universal solutions at a point. We see a cavalryman in an infantryman fighting. Remember the model before that is a bit more archaic, like Fatimid era, showing this kind of engagement may have to do with that early motive. The infantryman has a Khanjar dagger. He is definitely an infantryman in general, not just a dismounted horseman, because he has cross-gartered legs, right? The cavalryman instead has a lamellar cuirass that covers, however, only his abdomen and chest, so it's sort of short. This, there were these kind of smaller, like just torso protections that of course render the horseman a bit more agile. Again, this is normally typically a Mamluk thing, or at least to that degree of armoredness, a compromise between some more average wealth distribution in places like Egypt, but still some important step influence of sorts that needs this greater agility and lighter armor. Naturally, the Mamluks had just very heavy guys, but lots of otherwise non-metal armored horse archers as well. But this would be sort of an average of some sort. By the way, this same cavalryman has either aventail clothes falling across part of his shoulder. I see another cavalryman without armor. He has a long and slightly curved sword, which is interesting because, again, yes, it belongs to that saber tradition, but it's also something more, striking and, trusting than just cutting, right? We have various examples, really. We know that also many of these men would have worn mail armor under their coats. There are also mail-leaned Kazaghan type of armor, etc. So not necessarily these guys are that light as they look. There was some aesthetics connected to that kind of fabric cover also of armor that is very Eastern, but we have it also in the Western times. Then we have there is a series of guardsmen in a line carrying real or ceremonial weapons of some sort. There are axes, which again have an important role in Egypt. They are connected. We will see again with Tabardariya they were both ceremonial but actual real weapons. Like, always remember that basically everything up to 3.5 kilos was brought into battle, right? I mean, it was functional to combat. Then there were ceremonial weapons that were very expensive and that would have been treasured, maybe not spared. But aside from the fact that some were still used, they're still actual weapons, so you can definitely use them anyway in our circumstances. And guards units, we've seen it in other videos of this types of units, would have used also some of this clamorously offensively expensive, exaggeratedly expensive type of weapon as well. There is also a trident, interestingly enough, almost Seleucid if you think about this region. But it could have actually been a Central Asian thing. We'll talk about it someday. We see stone bows, the Kavs al-Bunduk. These are pellet shooting stone bows. And there is a guy also attacking birds with a curved knife, which is the ones that are struck by these pellets and finished in this way. So again, many are hunting scenes, which makes a lot of sense also because the Ayyubid, the Mamluk society is much more courtly, as we were pointing out, so hunting recurs more frequently, and though, as we've seen, was also a previous model for the aristocracy as always. It's just more frequent now. Now, the Baptiste de Saint Louis, we have already seen it well in the aforementioned videos. It's a very famous source, and again, there are so many. This is preserved at the Louvre Museum. It dates to roughly 1300. This was made in Egypt as an inlaid brass basin of this kind. Almost all of these very detailed figures are swordsmen, interestingly enough. And even more interestingly, that these swords are relatively short and broad, with only a slight curve. Right, so probably it's an Egyptian Egyptian hybrid with different traditions, but quite distinctive for the region ultimately. There are bows and arrows, maces, the Nachak or Nashk axe, essentially the half moon blade type. We see spears only in the hands of horsemen, except to beardless youngsters wearing gaiters with rank motifs on the sides. So there is some maybe spear initiatic kind of symbolism we can't fully grasp. Because a lot of that had to do with mounted combat as well, so the sense is that these guys would have been initiated probably to that level of horsemanship, reminiscent again of the steppes where most of these Mamluks were originally drawn from. So remember that, because it's an important change regarding the Egyptian establishment nevertheless. However, we already saw how such equipment was used by both the Persians and the Byzantines, and so it was somehow a pretty shared type of also iconography in this case. We see upward overlapping scales, which probably indicate lamellar, also used by horse archers. And this, I made a video about lamellar armor, explaining how, depending on how this lamellae are aligned, there is the imbrication, there is the different sense. Again, upwards openings normally, in fact, like a cavalry thing, because the hits from below cannot sort of enter the space between the lamellae that are otherwise sewn at the top and then open more towards the upwards to, otherwise they would eventually compress ever more the structure as long as they went up, so they're inclined outward, opening somehow. Which is also the most typical way lamellar armor was represented at the time. Remember that there are the Mongols around who use a lot of that as well. And so here, mostly the challenge is understanding how they were artistically represented, whether they have a specific, they surely have some specific technicity in that. In fact, for example, this type of armor we see here could be even heavily decorated fabric, covering maybe some actual lamella, or just not having any metal armor at all. Or it could even be chainmail. So you couldn't really tell in many circumstances. It's the problem even if we have for some Western comparisons. We do not understand what it's supposed to be, if it's an approximation. Because it's leather, it's, I don't know, even some very thick chainmail. Like, it's complicated. In any case, here we're looking at very high level equipment, also because the piece is in itself, like it's extremely refined and expensive. We see we observed it already, some Western feature that we noticed in the previous we listed in the previous videos for Egypt. There is a chapelle de fer, right? So some could even be simply sun hats, but the idea is that they would have been also metal, depending here. And two of them even perhaps have aventails, which is crazy because you don't see it in Europe that much, right? But that's important because, as we've seen, aventails are very step-like, and they mostly have to do with this extra protection for the neck, given all the arrows that fly around. They're not actually very pernicious individually, especially if you're heavily armored, but in fact, if you have these opening joints, like the neck, like such a vital part, you don't want to risk having of the so many arrows that would arrive at you, like one in fact hitting there. So that's why aventails are so more out there in the east, also covering the face sometimes, because again, you do need to also fight with your face uncovered at some point if you need visibility, sounds, shouting, things like that. In fact, as we know, there are certain types, especially for this lighter type of helmets in the West as well, that are, with open face. Normally our chapelle de fer, it doesn't have aventail, and but in this case it's different, right? So you would have that extra addition. Definitely there are these brim headgears with properly face covering male aventail, plus sleeveless lamellar cuirass, in this case at least once. So this is possibly even the depiction of a Mongol fighting a Mamluk. But these seem all sort of Mamluks. There's no specific context here to understand, so why would that be? Like, why would you have a solitary Mongol doing this? There are even two Mamluks fighting against one another in another scene. So here we understand that the same Mamluks used, of course, the heavy Yavsan lamellar cuirass, and that therefore they brought themselves some very strong Oriental, Persian, Turkic, Mongol influence, which is also what we know, generally speaking, from the broader documentation. For this series I choose just the iconography because it's easy to find it listed in these pictures, but it's always important to understand the actual background to this, what is that we know in general. And it's not like, again, archaeology is so much more generous, right? Also because different materials were reused or trashed, destroyed in different ways, whereas manuscripts, at least, they looked cool, they contained information that were precious in their own way, they were stored in particular ways, preserved. And so often they actually tell us much more about the world than even archaeological finds for such late of a time when we start finding more things. So never underestimate that at all. At the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo, there is yet another inlaid brass tray this time, dating to late 13th, 14th century Egypt. And so again, this is sort of similar to the baptistery at Samalia. However, there is much greater Persian influence, especially as far as the early 14th century period of Iranian art is concerned. there is a helmet with an oven tail, lamellar cuirass that has even elbow-length sleeves, and which is not to be given for granted also because the mechanisms, were sort of more sophisticated, so it's pretty heavy armor. There is a long box type quiver, which is very Central Asian, especially Turkic, right, in style. So we understand definitely there is something coming ever more from that step. Again, when we say Turkic here, it can be even, I don't know, the auxiliary, say, can be Ukraine, right, the steppes, even of Eastern Europe, so not necessarily something, Turk equates, especially at this point, just Central Asia. The Turks have expanded far and wide for a very long time. And remember where these Mamluks were mostly taken from, right? Not much from Central Asia, but from Eastern Europe. And again, they would come from all places, as we were saying before. I mean, there were surely some still Berber Mamluks of some sort. But there is no doubt that the overall military culture draws heavily from that Turkic nomadic background. Plus, on top, like all the Mongol influence. We've seen the Vafidiyak and all these elements that end up in the Mamluk armies from the various chunks of the fragmenting Mongol Empire, the Oceanic Empire. Then at the Topkapi Armory Museum of Constantinople, of course, we have a sword and scabbard dating to the 14th century as being connected with Egypt, but also possibly Syria, Iraq, Persia. So it's at least depicted often in the same, say, the art of these countries, but it may be even older than that and being part of a broader Middle Eastern tradition, even Arabo-Persian, telling the truth. And considering, in fact, the chronology, as we just observed, also sabers, this more steppe-influenced weaponry, were sort of now integral part of Levantine warfare as well, so it's perfectly matching with Egypt to an extent. Again, the art, the influence, it's all a very complicated thing. If we were to study just the art, the iconography of Mamluk Egypt, just compared to the one of Mesopotamia, lots of very interesting things would come up, but this is always the level of approximation that historian has. At some point you have to also accept that we don't know too much. But again, everything is so, as I said at the beginning, so obvious, right? So relevant, so fitting. There's nothing really exceeding the general understanding, general logic, right? And so even in all the things that can happen, maybe, I don't know, there were Westerners even fighting around here, so, but we don't find much. We just find that in connection with Egypt or sort of the more Western exposed places, but they're mostly all, they're essentially, as you understood, a basis for like the canon, the essential, the typical, and then some exception, because none of this stuff was really standardized in the way we approximately understand this in a modern sense. Nevertheless, it's always, again, varying, and this variation is hardly out of context. If anything, it derives from some sort of neighboring influence of sort, and so again, it's fully acceptable and understandable. Now, we finished Egypt. I like this series because it feels like a good anchor for anyone who wants to start at least understanding a bit the area, even in a relatively repetitive fashion, but that, however, connects pretty well with the entire work we make. I'm glad we're talking about medieval Egypt, because people fixate especially with the Mamluks, but there isn't so much focus on, especially the Fatimids, And again, I'm also creating lots of different playlists to integrate this picture. Please watch this video. I mean, I know that you will not you will not do that if you will not click on this one for me to hear. So it's sort of useless to say, but I really mean it. Like, for all those who listen, just always know that what I do here is connected with the rest. It's not just per se. You don't have to wonder why I do it or whether it appeals to anybody's tastes in particular. You have to understand it through the work that I made, which overall is a much bigger thing than anyone has done on YouTube so far in these topics especially. And I think that I'm searching here for my medieval Egypt playlist. There's always so much to, and again, I didn't expect to make 3 videos on Egypt specifically, but it turned out to be pretty relevant, pretty obvious in the end. I have a Fatimid army organization video, yes. I have Baptiste de Saint Louis made that. Yeah, it's not even so much, telling the truth, but it starts being a considerable amount. I wish, again, it's only 2 videos, this is the 13th. It's important. Egypt deserves a lot of that consideration, and unfortunately it doesn't get too much like in pop culture. I'm really curious to see what the rest of the tube has on that, because at this point I'm really wondering. I know that my videos are what they are, like in terms of entertainment. They don't really fit YouTube in that sense, but aside from the general info, like if I search medieval Egyptian warfare, there's not even a key on YouTube to insert. Warfare in ancient, this is why I hate YouTube in many ways. I search medieval Egyptian warfare, first result, warfare in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia 3500 to 1200 BC. I search for medieval Egyptian warfare. I don't care about your 300,000 views sent Roman history stuff. I search for medieval Egyptian warfare. And again, ancient Egyptian warfare and weapons. And then Exodus, Gods and Kings, click the Battle of Kadesh. What the... I can't... And there is no thing here, again, even Scholar Gladiatoria. Then the user also watch God of War Egypt. It's all about ancient Egypt. And this is revolting. And this, oh my god, there's my stuff. I don't know whether I'm searching this through my own... because usually YouTube shows you a bit your content more frequently. But again, it's only Egyptians, ancient Egyptian stuff. I try to use brackets, but this is to say how much YouTube forces you, alright, to see things that you don't want to see, that do not also teach you anything. The only medieval Egyptian, I can't believe it. There is only me. There's only me. This is insane. This is, guys, what I'm talking about. You see this? I put medieval Egyptian warfare in bracket, and only my content appears. I wanna try on Google now. And yeah, only me, only Schwerpunkt. This is insane. This is insane. This is utterly insane. To the extent of, you see, why don't you freaking watch the video? Right? You can see that it's definitely a shared fault of some sort. Right? I'm basically the only person talking about medieval Egyptian warfare on YouTube. Very well. Of course, I'm sure that if I Google Fatimid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, I will find plenty of stuff, don't get me wrong, but the simple key, medieval Egyptian warfare, I'm the only person. And if I use it without brackets, there's nobody giving you any of it. This is really bad. This is why YouTube is bad, and that's why I'm actually getting an ever greater amount of views from external, from Google mostly, because guess what? People search for that and they find it. Maybe they don't watch YouTube then, but they end up in my on my content if they click at some point. So I think this is incredibly important and revealing overall, considering the whole picture. Very well. So this is also done for today. I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.